And conflict is a driver of complexity and sociality. It's a driver of complexity in material culture. It creates an arms race, right? And that context is different for African hunter-gatherers. So I think that, prior to this, African hunter-gatherers and these early modern humans were probably not particularly warlike, but when they start to move into coastal adaptations or riverine adaptations, they start to reduce their mobility. Reducing your mobility allows you to invest more in your material culture because you don't have to carry tons of stuff around, right? Because you're not moving around. Warfare goes up. Now there's a selection for projectile weaponry, and it creates a social selection. And that's the basis of my argument, that when humans move into that niche, it creates a new type of human.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Season 2 of the Liberal Gun Owners Lens podcast. I am Miyanovich, and I will be your pilot on an unprecedented ride through the most innovative and forward-thinking analysis of the relationship between humans and guns on planet Earth. The entire nexus between guns and public safety needs a wake-up call, and Liberal Gun Owners is here to rock that party. Are you somebody who thinks you know what's going on with guns and public safety? I don't give a shit. I'm dragging your ass into the future whether you like it or not. It takes so much effort with hypothesis, theoretical work. It takes so much to have that little, like it's tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars in years. Just from what I'm looking at, I will have aha moments in that, oh shit, that took me 4 years of almost full time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you remember the cryptotefra result that we had from the Toba volcanic eruption.
I don't.
Well, Toba is a volcano in Sumatra, and it exploded 74,000 years ago. It was the biggest volcanic eruption in 10 million years. And when volcanoes erupt, they shoot up these microscopic little shards of glass called cryptotefra. And a super eruption like that can send a lot of it up, and it can travel quite far. Back in 2005, we had the idea that we might be able to find those little bits of glass, those shards at Pinnacle Point, because it was so powerful. And we started looking for them, and we published our first paper on the discovery of those at Pinnacle Point in 2018. 13 years.
You have to love it, man, to stick with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's move back to the Leakey Foundation video and talk that I saw you give. And I wanted to ask you a question because in the other videos that I'm familiar with you, you talk about the weaponry, the projectile weaponry, decently, like a lot, in your hypothesis, which includes, basically you're focusing on the importance of the coastal foraging niche and how that natural selection regime during the penultimate glacial period puts the press on humans and the need for them to be able to figure out things like the tide chart and the emergence of the complex projectile and hyperprosociality. All these things come together, right, and create, this is a gross way to put it, but a newer human. The Curtis Marian's hypothesis about the parental group for the modern human lineage comes out of the south coast of South Africa, basically, quote unquote, forged by this natural selection regime that happens as the result of the penultimate glacial period. It puts pressure upon these humans, and the humans come out the other side as some kind of new being. that is not like we were before. We're hyper pro-social. We have advanced cognition. We're doing things like figuring out the tide chart or the tide tracking. We have this new projectile technology, and then we're kind of a low-grade steamroller or a high-grade steamroller, however you want to put that. We just roll. So that's in your hypothesis. When you spoke at the Leakey Foundation, you don't really talk about the projectile technology as much. You just talk about the coastal foraging and that. So why is that?
Could have been the time, time limit. They talk like that. You got 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and I might have been trying to focus on getting people to the point where they understand the importance of coastal resources, and so that can take a lot, right? Most people in audiences don't know what a spring tide is, right? They think spring is the season, and it actually has nothing to do with the seasons. It's because the tide springs back and forth from really high to really low. So you really have to walk people through all the steps of the argument, the coastal ecology, and so sometimes I have to leave things out, and I probably left that out. But to give you an example, like I was saying, I was in New York, and I went up to the American Museum of Natural History because they've always had one of the best exhibits on Northwest Coast Indians anywhere in the world. And the reason is Franz Boas, who was really the first anthropologist in the United States. He trained the first generation. He did field work with Northwest Coast Indians. So by Northwest Coast Indians, I mean Native American peoples who lived on the coast from Oregon, Washington, and up into British Columbia and up into Canada. And these are hunter-gatherers. They lived totally off of the land, right? No agriculture. And they were probably one of the most complex hunter-gatherers that we've ever encountered in the record. So they have chiefdom-level societies, it seems, or near chiefdom-level societies. They had slaves. They had huge amounts of economic differentiation and power differentiation. They lived in villages, so they didn't move about the landscape a lot. And I wanted to take a look at their material culture. And one of the things I saw that I had not seen before, they had two examples of their body armor. They built body armor, it looked like medieval warfare body armor. Hunter-gatherers. This is really unusual, and it's because they had really, really high levels of warfare. In general, coastal hunter-gatherers and riverine hunter-gatherers have really high levels of warfare relative to hunter-gatherers that are focused on terrestrial resources. So, the hunter-gatherers in Africa that are not coastal, they have very low levels of warfare or intertribal conflict. But when people invest in riverine adaptations and coastal adaptations, warfare goes way up. And this is really well documented. In fact, I'm working on trying to quantify it now. A lot of it is not quantified. It's observed, and we all get it, but it would be very nice to be able to move it into a quantified scientific system. And the reason is that when coastal resources and riverine resources are really dense and predictable, and when you have dense and predictable resources that are rich, they create competition, right? People want to steal them. People want to take that land. So conflict goes way up. And conflict is a driver of complexity and sociality. It's a driver of complexity in material culture. It creates an arms race, right? And that context is different for African hunter-gatherers. So I think that, prior to this, African hunter-gatherers and these early modern humans were probably not particularly warlike. But when they start to move into coastal adaptations or riverine adaptations, they start to reduce their mobility. Reducing your mobility allows you to invest more in your material culture because you don't have to carry tons of stuff around, right? Because you're not moving around. Warfare goes up. Now there's a selection for projectile weaponry. and it creates a social selection. And that's the basis of my argument, that when humans move into that niche, it creates a new type of human.
So this is good. We'll take an aside because there's one thing that I want to talk to you about, which you just brought up, and that is the baseline I should say it this way: the complexity that arises from baseline human conflict. That conflict creates progress. This is a very hard idea for a lot of contemporary humans to maybe understand, acknowledge, because we are so driven by being peaceable and democratic, and we have ideals and morality, and we have a Western mythology, and we have a whole bunch of things like this. But
Right.
in my experience, what is happening is I'm noticing how difficult it is for humans to acknowledge our human behavioral baseline. 1, 2, that it includes aggression, and 3, that progress can come from it, or does come from it, or critical progress has come from it, unfortunately. So, the term that I've heard people use is like anthropodenial, like there are kind of animalistic aspects to us, or maybe you would say there are animal aspects to us, and people refuse to look at it or refuse to acknowledge it. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. Why do people do that? Why does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, um, I think unfortunately politics gets wrapped up in it too. Um, the there's an entire within my field of people who study hunters and gatherers. Okay, so I focus on human origins, but there's also just a community of archaeologists and anthropologists who work on hunter gatherers, and they're not necessarily working on human evolution, right? Um, there's a debate in that community as to how much conflict there was in hunter-gatherer societies. But I would say that the majority of people who know the hunter-gatherer record would say, yeah, there was conflict in warfare in hunter-gatherer societies, and it was particularly prevalent among some hunter-gatherers versus others. Okay, so there was a big survey study done of warfare in hunter-gatherer societies. I can't remember when the paper was published. It was probably published 10 years ago. And they came to the conclusion that hunter-gatherers were relatively peaceful, but they excluded all the coastal hunter-gatherers from the study with the argument that these are unusual hunter-gatherers because they don't move about the landscape. If you put the coastal ones in there, the warfare rates would go way up. So there is a debate in that community, but I think the majority of people who know the literature and so on would say as soon as you get hunter-gatherers committed to dense and predictable resources, fishing, coastal resources, etc., warfare rates go up. And warfare does have a stimulating effect to complexity of technology because it creates this. Humans are locked into projectile weapons as their primary mode for hunting and warfare.
Yeah.
And so that now creates selective forces to increase distance, power, accuracy. And so that gets dialed in. But it also happens with hunting, right? So if hunter-gatherers start focusing on megafauna, for example, elephant-sized animals or mammoths or whatever, you need a weapon. You want a weapon that puts quite a bit of distance between you and that animal, and also has a lot of penetration power.
Yeah.
So again, that context, megafauna hunting creates selection for improvements in projectile weaponry. And so there's lots of context that will do that. But yeah, for sure, warfare can drive technological advance. I don't think there's any debate about that among the people who study technology, the history of technology, right?
Yeah. there's been an ongoing problem, it seems, because I've read James Keeley.
Right. Right.
And
He's an archaeologist.
yeah, and so his one book, the myth of the peaceful savage, is a book that I've read, and of course Pinker brings up the myth of the noble savage. He calls it the myth of the noble savage. I think he was trying not to bite Keeley's title, but he brings that up in the Blank Slate book. That in academia and in other places with intellectuals, there has been this effort to paint ancient peoples as like carrying beads and loving each other and no conflict and so on and so forth. But it sounds like at least the best determination would be some ancient hunter-gatherers, and it makes sense. You're all spread out. What are you going to fight for? There's like you're most likely less, if you're terrestrial and spread out, you're probably not going to get into it because you're busy somewhere else, right?
Right.
So you have some that aren't going to get into it, some that will get into it. And you bring up this point in the Leakey talk, where you believe originally we were much more like that, like low fidelity conflict, don't really get into it that much. But then when we hit that natural selection regime during the penultimate glacial period, we change and we become something else.
Right. Well, I would argue, look, I mean, in all hunter-gatherer societies, there's a lot of interpersonal violence. Okay. That's within group violence. And we have lots of evidence for that. That's people settling disputes with violence. Right? Violence is a tool, unfortunately, and people use that tool to get what they want. And so a lot of that's domestic violence, male on female, and then a lot of it is also male on male within the same social group. They could be competing for resources. They could competing for women. There's lots of evidence for that. Anyone who's trying to deny it isn't looking at the data or is pushing a political agenda. What I'm saying is okay, so that's kind of interpersonal, intra-group violence. The difference is when you get intergroup violence, right? Groups that have warriors that are fighting each other, and that's a different thing. And that I think is probably pretty uncommon with hunter-gatherers that are focused on terrestrial resources and tropical environments like Africa. But when they move to these really high-quality, dense, predictable resources, that then drives interpersonal violence or intergroup violence.
Yeah. And would you say it's fair to say, if we extrapolate into the contemporary realm, that if we're dealing with violence, if Curtis and Randy want to make the world a better place and we want to mitigate human violence, when we sit down at the table to go, okay, let's start at the basis of this. So let's talk about what we're really dealing with instead of all this bullshit that's out there or stuff that's out there. We should be considering that there's elements of innateness in this. And when we're looking worldwide at what's going on with any kind of violence with people, we have to acknowledge that humans have some kind of an innate conflict piece. And while we can work to mitigate it, right, we can't necessarily eliminate it from people. Do you think that's fair?
I mean, it's a really complex question. I would say that people have a psychology, an evolved psychology, where violence is built in as one of the tool sets for getting what you want, and that there's probably variation in populations between some people who have that more than other people. And but what I would say is probably and look, I mean, society can kind of overcome that by making sure everybody has what they need to live a comfortable, happy life, right? So if everybody has what they need to live a comfortable, happy life, you're not going to have a lot of crime. You're not going to have a lot of violent crime. But when people don't have those things, there'll be people who resort to violence to getting them. That's part of the tool set. So that's kind of, within society violence that policy and wealth can take care of, distribution of wealth, in my opinion. And then you have, warfare, which is normally between nation states. And we can think of also that as being kind of tribal warfare, right? It's between ethno-linguistic groups. So, what you see happening between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and what regularly has happened in Europe over many, many, hundreds of years of history, right? The vast majority of conflicts in Europe have been ethnic groups fighting each other. Germans, French, et cetera, normally defined by language, sometimes grouped by religion, right? So wars of Reformation and so on. And I think that's a different thing because I think people have an evolved psychology to be tribal, what we call tribal. In other words, they tend to favor people in, this kind of in-group favoritism, out-group bias, to favor people that have grown up in the same cultural group, and people have ways of recognizing those people. So they tend to group like that. And when they feel threatened, or also their resource base is being attacked, they tend to get together as a nation or as a ethnic group to fight for resources. And that could be agricultural land, it could be access to water. We're already seeing it. The entire Sahel region of Africa is at war.
Yeah.
Right. That's the Sahel is that band of, it can be a fairly rich agricultural band on the southern flank of the Sahara Desert, between the Sahara Desert and Central Africa. That traditionally has been a breadbasket for Africa, from Ethiopia all the way to West Africa. The whole place is at war.
Yeah.
And, this is because, this is a combination of ethnic warfare. There's also a religious aspect, Islam and Christianity, to it, but it's because the resource base is under threat.
Yeah.
Climate change is degrading the resource base, and people are now have to move.
Yeah.
And they're going to fight.
And there's also a history of pastoralists conflict in Africa as well, right? Not just the agricultural, but there are still...
Right. Well, many of the people are pastoral, right? I mean, one of the big groups involved in this warfare are the Tuareg, and that's an ethnic group that is a camel pastoralist group. Okay. They're not. And, pastoral groups a lot of times have cultural norms that define agriculture as being a culturally unclean activity, right? Digging in the ground and growing crops. Pastoral groups, because they are mobile, often prey on agricultural groups. And often pastoral groups have a cultural tradition of warfare and so on. So they tend to be quite good at it.
And they have a culture of like pride and status and things like that.
Yep. It's not unusual.
Yeah. And I was recently reading about how common it is for African pastoral groups to have firearms. And even though there are a lot of laws against regulations relative to firearms, they easily acquire them through illicit means. So firearms are a pretty regular part of.
Oh yeah, yeah. And the pastoral warfare in Africa, used to be with spear mostly. These are, spear-based warfare systems. Spears have been replaced with machine guns, so now it's more lethal. But it's also changed the game. And there's people studying this. Right? We have a person here at ASU that studies that.
Okay, I'll look more into it. I just got turned on to it like recently, but I didn't realize what you just talked about was really a thing.
Oh yeah.
So let's go back to the leaky talk, and you bring up the waters recede, this shelf opens up, it's the size of Ireland. And previously, with your hypothesis, I had envisioned these ancient hunter-gatherers on Pinnacle Point who are doing coastal foraging, and they're not really engaging in terrestrial hunting. That was my original conception.
Right. Okay.
And so now I'm seeing that this thing opens up. So they're not just coastal foraging. They're doing the old school hunting also.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So our reconstruction of that revealed plain, once the waters recede, is that it was a very rich grassland. And there were all kinds of, those rich African grasslands get all of the animals that you imagine Africa has, right? It's got big-bodied grazing species, wildebeest, hartebeest, zebra, and even bigger stuff that is now extinct. And for sure, so even though these people are coastally foraging, they're out hunting these animals. So in some of the writing I've done, I've called it kind of a sweet spot. There's a point where you have the caves at Pinnacle Point. The coast is still close enough that you can exploit it, but you have a plain there with big animals running around. So now you have an economy where you can coastally forage and you can hunt big game, and that's a very rich ecosystem for a hunter-gatherer, and a great ecosystem.
In the previous lectures, in the previous work, that hadn't been talked about very much. So I was wondering if even you had a little bit more of a motion towards like, oh my God, this is probably a lot more terrestrial hunting than I thought.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it came because in 2014, we really started this big study to reconstruct the ecology of the Paleogallus Plain. We didn't know anything about it prior to that. Now we know a lot, right? So, like I said, in 2020, we published 21 papers reconstructing its ecology. And at that point, I was like, okay, we need to build this into the model.
Yeah.
And that's when the hunting thing. But, here's the thing is that the real commitment to heat treatment and microlithic weaponry, projectile weaponry, appears around 71,000 years ago, 72,000 years ago. But that's also when that plain is really rich.
Okay.
So I think what we're seeing is people are adapting to these hunting contexts that are revealed by lowering sea levels, and they have quite a rich resource base, but it's probably also quite competitive because of its richness.
Yeah, probably more competitive than we thought or originally were thinking about because it all opens up.
Yep.
So because that refuge area, when you look at the original estimates for the couple refuge areas, it's just 5 or a couple or whatever. Now you're opening up an entire country, like on the bottom.
Right.
So this probably has implications too for population as well. Maybe original population estimates were a little bit too low. Maybe there is more potentially.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the richer the resource base, the population numbers will go up.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, there are some limits. I mean, hunter-gatherers don't get really dense populations until they start having, resources like really rich salmon runs, and they're killing whales and stuff like that, which happens on the northwest coast. That doesn't happen in South Africa. We don't know why it doesn't. I mean, I think it has to do with one of the reasons Northwest Coast Indians could be really productive in that environment is, as trivial as this might sound, the cedar trees. So cedar trees are a great source of lumber. You can build extraordinary boats out of them to go hunt whales. You can build extraordinary traps out of them to catch salmon that are going up and down the rivers. South Africa doesn't have the equivalent of that. The winter rainfall region has really scrubby kind of trees. So wood is not something that's easy to come by. And that might have been a bit of a block for kind of moving to the next stage of coastal foraging, which would be this maritime boating. And when you kill a whale, now you're talking a really dense, predictable resource, right? Because it's enough to feed 30 people for months. So yeah, I think those were, so South Africa, my thinking now is when, you get our sweet spot when they can both coastally forage and hunt big game. And that's probably the best, that's your Shangri-La moment.
Yeah.
Right. And when the sea comes back up and that plain is submerged, the returns in that environment go down. We know that because the current terrestrial environment isn't going to produce a grassland ecosystem for those big animals. As
humans spread out, you can see from the artifacts that we leave, we certainly hug the coast a lot. Is that fair to say?
Well, here's the thing, you would think, well, what about the coastline in Kenya and Tanzania? Coastlines vary widely in their productivity.
Mm-hmm.
So the key feature that makes a coastline productive for intertidal foraging is cold water and particularly upwelling water. So if you have an ecosystem that's upwelling that brings up phytoplankton, then you're going to have a really rich intertidal zone. Those aren't everywhere, right? So the coastline of East Africa, the intertidal zone is quite poor. And I've done reconnaissance there, and I haven't found a shell-midden record there like we have in South Africa. Okay. The one other area in Africa that's quite productive is the coastline of Morocco, the Atlantic coastline. And people have done work there, and there are hunter-gatherers using the coast. It doesn't seem like it's as rich as South Africa, but we have yet to really do a comparative study.
You think those coastal skills could die out and then have to be rediscovered again? Do you think that it's carried on well, or?
Well, I think once you have a modern human with all their psychological and cognitive machinery, if they move into an environment, they could be a totally terrestrial hunter-gatherer, but they move into an environment that's rich coastally, they'll figure it out in a few years.
Okay. Within a generation, easily.
Oh, yeah.